She thought she knew her father, until she read the letters he never wanted her to find. The attic smelled like time itself, a thick, layered scent of dust and old wood, of cardboard that had absorbed decades of summer heat and winter cold, of fabric slowly surrendering to moth and age. Sarah Mitchell stood at the top of the narrow stairs, her hand still gripping the rough wooden railing, worn smooth by generations of hands, and felt the weight of absence settle over her shoulders like a heavy blanket that would never quite warm her. 3 weeks. It had been exactly 3 weeks since they'd buried her father on a grey October morning that seemed too ordinary for such a monumental loss. The leaves had been turning, brilliant reds and golds against a slate sky, and the honor guard had folded the flag with mechanical precision while Sarah stood dry-eyed and numb, unable to process that the man in the casket, the man who'd raised her, who'd taught her to ride a bike and balance a checkbook and change a tire, was really gone. The house felt wrong without him. Too quiet, too still. For 42 years, this modest 2-story colonial in suburban Connecticut had been filled with her father's gentle presence, the soft shuffle of his slippers on hardwood floors at 6 in the morning, the rustle of his newspaper at the breakfast table while he worked through the crossword in careful pencil, the low hum of whatever game played on the television he pretended not to watch too closely. He'd been a quiet man, her father. Not cold, never cold, but reserved in a way she'd always attributed to his generation. Men born in the 1920s didn't spill their feelings, didn't wear their hearts on their sleeves. That's just how they were. Now there was only silence, and the overwhelming task of sorting through 87 years of accumulated memories. Her mother had passed 5 years ago, cancer, quick and merciless, and Dad had never been much of a housekeeper after that. The house had slowly filled with the detritus of a long life lived. Newspapers stacked in corners, mail piled on the dining room table he no longer used for eating, photographs in frames, gathering dust. The attic had become a repository for everything he couldn't bear to sort through himself. Her mother's clothes still in boxes sealed with tape, Christmas decorations that hadn't seen daylight in a decade, furniture too worn to use but too meaningful to discard, the accumulated artifacts of a marriage that had lasted 52 years. Sarah had been putting this off, this final reckoning with her father's life, but her brother Tom was flying in from Seattle next week to help sell the house, and she couldn't avoid it any longer. Someone had to go through it all. Someone had to decide what stayed and what went, what mattered and what didn't. And as the older sibling, as the one who'd stayed close to home, who'd brought her own children to visit every Sunday, who'd been there at the hospital when he'd slipped away in the early morning hours with his children on either side of his bed, this responsibility fell to her. She took a breath, tasting the mustiness of old air and forgotten things, and stepped into the cluttered space. The attic ran the length of the house, with sloped ceilings following the roofline and one small circular window at each end. November sunlight slanted through the eastern window, catching the dust she'd disturbed climbing the stairs and transforming it into something almost beautiful. Thousands of tiny particles suspended in the light, dancing slowly in currents of air she couldn't feel. The floorboards creaked under her weight, loud in the stillness, and for a moment she felt like an intruder in a space that had been undisturbed for years. Cardboard boxes were stacked against the sloped ceiling on both sides, creating narrow corridors between the accumulated years. Their corners had softened with age, and their sides bore labels in her mother's precise cursive: winter coats, tax returns, 1985, 1990, Sarah's school papers, Tom's baseball trophies. Sarah felt a pang looking at that handwriting, so familiar it hurt. Her mother had been the organized one, the keeper of order in their household. Dad had just been the steady presence, the man who went to work every day for 35 years at the post office, who came home and tended his garden, who showed love through actions rather than words. She'd brought supplies, trash bags, packing tape, a marker for labeling. She worked methodically, opening boxes one by one, sorting contents into piles for keeping, donating, or discarding. Old coats that smelled of mothballs and her mother's perfume. Tools her father had inherited from his own father, a complete set of woodworking chisels wrapped in oiled cloth, a hand drill that must have been 70 years old, a level with the bubble still perfectly centered. Photo albums she set aside carefully, knowing she'd need hours to go through those properly, knowing each page would be a journey through faces and moments she couldn't bear to rush through. The work was exhausting, both physically and emotionally. Each item was a small reminder of lives fully lived, of her parents nearly 6 decades together, of a childhood that seemed both yesterday and a lifetime ago. She found her high school yearbooks, her father's college diploma from a state school he'd attended on the GI Bill, her mother's wedding dress carefully preserved in tissue paper. Every object told a story, and her father was no longer here to tell her what any of them meant. It was nearly 4 o'clock when she found it. The box was pushed far back under the eaves on the north side of the attic, behind a broken floor lamp with a fringed shade, a stack of National Geographic magazines from the 1970s that someone had meant to throw away but never did, and a rolled-up rug that moths had reduced to something beyond salvaging. Sarah had to shift several boxes and crouch low to reach it, her knees protesting as she pulled it free. Unlike all the others, it wasn't cardboard but wood, an old military footlocker, forest green paint chipped and faded to reveal grey primer beneath, with a rusted latch and leather handle cracked with age and desiccated by decades. In an unconditioned attic, the footlocker was heavier than she expected. She dragged it into the center of the attic, where the ceiling was highest, where she could sit cross-legged on the dusty floor, and wiped the accumulated grime from its top with her sleeve. Stenciled letters, white and official and slightly faded, spelled out a name and number she'd seen only once before, on his death certificate when she'd had to fill out the paperwork. PVT James R. Mitchell, 13045782. Her father's name, his army serial number. Sarah sat back on her heels, staring at the box as if it might open itself. Her father never talked about the war. Oh, she knew he'd served, that wasn't a secret. There was a single photograph on the mantel downstairs, formal and stiff, showing him in uniform with corporal stripes on his sleeve, young and serious. But whenever she'd asked about it as a child, full of curiosity about what he'd done and where he'd gone, he'd given vague, unsatisfying answers that felt like doors closing gently but firmly in her face. "I was just a soldier, sweetheart." It was a long time ago. Not much to tell, really. He'd deflect with a smile and a question about her homework or her friends or what she wanted for dinner, and eventually, as children do, she'd stopped asking. She'd assumed he'd done clerical work or something safe and distant from combat. Maybe he'd been stationed in England or worked supply lines in the Pacific. He was too gentle, too soft-spoken, too fundamentally kind to have been in the thick of things. That's what she'd always told herself. Her father was a postal worker who'd retired after 35 years with a modest pension and a plastic plaque, who'd spent his weekends tending his tomato plants and watching baseball with the sound turned low so he wouldn't disturb anyone. He wasn't a warrior, he couldn't be. The latch resisted at first, rust and time having fused the metal parts together. Sarah worked it carefully, not wanting to break it, applying pressure gradually until it gave with a metallic snap that seemed too loud in the quiet attic, like the breaking of a seal. She lifted the lid slowly, half afraid of what she might find, half convinced it would be empty or filled with nothing more interesting than old uniforms or camping equipment. She caught her breath. Letters. Dozens of them. Hundreds of them. They were bundled in stacks, tied with faded ribbon that had once been red, but now looked more like rust and string, and in some cases rubber bands that had perished and broken, leaving the letters loose. Thin paper, the kind she'd seen in documentaries about World War II, V-mail forms that had been photographed and reduced to save shipping space, then printed out again on the other end. Official military stationery, with APO addresses printed in the corner. Personal letters on whatever paper the soldiers could find, notebook paper, pages torn from journals, even what looked like the back of requisition forms. The envelopes were addressed in careful, slanted handwriting that grew more familiar the longer she looked at it. Her father's handwriting. She'd seen it on birthday cards and Christmas lists, on notes left on the kitchen counter, on checks written to pay bills. But younger, somehow, the letters formed with more deliberation, as if each word required conscious effort. The hand of someone still learning to be an adult, still finding his voice. Each envelope was addressed to the same person, Mrs. Dorothy Mitchell, her grandmother. Her father's mother, who'd passed away when Sarah was only 7 years old. She had fragmentary memories of a small, neat woman with white hair and gentle hands who smelled of lavender and always had butterscotch candies in her purse. Sarah's hands trembled as she reached into the box. Beneath the letters lay other artifacts, a stack of photographs, their edges curled and colors faded to sepia and gray, some black and white with that particular grain that marked them as products of cheap cameras and wartime film processing. Military documents with official seals, orders, citations, transfer papers, ribbons and medals wrapped carefully in a square of faded olive-drab cloth, the fabric so old it felt like it might disintegrate at a rough touch. A pair of dog tags on a ball chain, the metal scratched and worn, the embossed letters and numbers still legible. James R. Mitchell, his serial number, T42 for his tetanus shot, P for Protestant. A patch torn from a uniform, carefully preserved. The insignia of the 101st Airborne Division, the screaming eagle in yellow thread against black fabric, still visible despite the fraying edges and the dark stains that might have been mud or might have been blood. 101st Airborne paratroopers. Her father had been a paratrooper. Sarah felt something shift in her understanding, like a foundation settling. Paratroopers weren't rear echelon troops. They were elite infantry, specially trained, dropped behind enemy lines. They jumped out of airplanes in the middle of the night into hostile territory. They were the tip of the spear. Her father, the quiet postal worker who couldn't stand the sound of helicopters, who flinched at car backfires, who turned off the television whenever war movies came on, had been a paratrooper. She lifted one bundle of letters, her fingers clumsy, and untied the ribbon that held them together. The fabric came apart in her hands, too old and fragile to survive. She opened the envelope on top, pulling out the impossibly thin paper inside, so thin she could see her hand through it, covered in the same careful handwriting. The date in the corner read, April 18th, 1944. The postmark, faded but legible, said, U.S. Army Postal Service, and showed a date 2 weeks later, the time it had taken the letter to travel from wherever he'd been to his mother's mailbox in Connecticut. "Dear Ma," it began. Sarah's throat tightened. She'd never heard her father call anyone Ma. He'd called his mother Mom in the handful of memories Sarah had of them together. But here, at 19 or 20 years old, writing from somewhere far from home, he'd been someone different. Someone younger, someone more vulnerable, someone she'd never known existed. She read on, and with each word, the silence of the attic seemed to deepen, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Sarah didn't leave the attic that night. She called her husband Mark, told him she'd be late, that she'd found something important. He knew better than to ask questions when her voice sounded like that, tight and distant, like she was calling from somewhere far away. She ordered pizza, ate it cold while reading letters by the light of her phone when the single bulb wasn't bright enough. The letters told a story she'd never heard, but as she read, another portrait emerged alongside them, one that lived in her memory, the father she'd grown up with, the man she thought she understood. Robert Mitchell had been a creature of routine. Every morning at 6, he'd wake without an alarm. Sarah remembered hearing him move through the house, the creak of floorboards, the whistle of the kettle, the rustle of the newspaper. He'd sit at the kitchen table doing the crossword in pen. He never made mistakes. Or if he did, he never let anyone see them. He'd worked as a mail carrier for 40 years. Rain or shine, he'd walked his route through Valdosta's neighborhoods. 23 miles a day, 5 days a week, reliable, steady, the kind of man you could set your watch by. Sarah had asked him once in high school why he'd chosen that job. "I like walking," he'd said. "I like being outside, and I like bringing people things they're waiting for. Letters from loved ones, birthday cards, good news sometimes. It's honest work." She'd thought it was a simple answer from a simple man. Now reading letters written by a 20-year-old paratrooper who'd jumped into occupied France, she wondered if there was more to it. Maybe a man who'd seen the worst of humanity found peace in carrying messages for the living. Maybe it was his way of continuing something he'd started during the war. Sarah unfolded another letter from January 1945. "Dear Mama, we are in Belgium now, in the forests. It is so cold the water in our canteens freezes solid. We sleep in holes we dig in the snow. The Germans are all around us. We hear them at night, moving through the trees. Sometimes we hear them singing. Yesterday I saw a deer, a doe, picking her way through the shattered trees." She stopped and looked at me, and for a moment everything was quiet. No guns, no artillery, no shouting. Just me and this deer and the snow falling between us. She wasn't afraid. I held very still and watched her until she walked away. And then I cried, "Mama." I sat in my foxhole and cried like a child, because that deer reminded me there is still beauty in the world, even here. And I had almost forgotten. I promise you, when I come home, I will remember. I will notice every beautiful thing. Every sunrise, every bird, every flower. I will never take any of it for granted again. Your loving son. Bobby Sarah's hands trembled. She set the letter down, and suddenly she was 10 years old again, in their backyard on Magnolia Street. Early morning, dew heavy on the grass. Her father was kneeling among the tomato plants, very still. "Dad," she'd called. He'd looked up, his face radiant, peaceful in a way she rarely saw. "Come here, sweetheart," he'd whispered, quietly. She'd tiptoed over. There, perched on the garden fence, was a cardinal, bright red against the grey morning, singing. They'd stood together for 5 full minutes, watching, not talking, just being. When the cardinal flew away, her father had squeezed her shoulder gently. "Beautiful things are everywhere," he'd said. "You just have to slow down enough to see them." She'd nodded, not really understanding. She'd been 10. She'd wanted to watch cartoons. Now, 32 years later, sitting in this dusty attic, Sarah finally understood. He'd been keeping a promise made in a frozen foxhole to a mother he wasn't sure he'd ever see again. He'd come home and noticed every beautiful thing, every sunrise, every bird, every flower, every moment with his daughter. Sarah wiped her eyes and reached for another letter. March 1945, from somewhere in Germany. "Dear Mama, we crossed into Germany last week. The towns are destroyed, rubble everywhere. The people who remain look at us with hatred or fear or such emptiness. It is hard to tell the difference. We found a concentration camp yesterday. I cannot write about what we saw there. I will not put those images in your mind. But I understand now why we are here, why we had to come, why Jimmy and Tom and all the others had to die. There is evil in the world, Mama. Real evil. Not the kind preachers talk about on Sunday, but the kind that walks on 2 legs and builds systems of cruelty so vast you cannot believe humans are capable of it until you see it with your own eyes. I am so tired, Mama. Tired in my bones. Tired in my soul. But I will keep going, because this has to end. I love you." Bobby Sarah sat back. Her father had witnessed the Holocaust firsthand, and he'd come home and never mentioned it, not once. She thought about Sunday dinners growing up. Her father would say grace before every meal, simple words. "Lord, thank you for this food, for this family, for this day." Then he'd eat slowly, savoring every bite, never leaving anything on his plate. "We don't waste food in this house," he'd say. Not angry or harsh, just fact. There are people in the world who are hungry. We honor their suffering by being grateful for what we have. She'd thought he was being frugal, Depression-era thinking. Now she understood. He'd seen people starving. He'd seen what hunger looked like when it was weaponized, and so every meal became an act of remembrance, an act of gratitude. How many other things had she misunderstood? How many of her father's quiet habits had been shaped by horrors she couldn't imagine? Sarah pulled another bundle from the footlocker. April and May, 1945, the end of the war in Europe. "Dear Mama, the war in Europe is over. Germany has surrendered. We are victorious. I should be happy. We drank liberated wine last night and sang songs. It felt good to laugh. But Mama, I cannot shake this weight. I think of all the boys who did not make it to see this day. Jimmy, who died on the beach. Tom, who stepped on a mine. Red, who took a sniper's bullet. Mike, who died in my arms. I think, why them? Why not me? I have no answer. It was chance, Mama. Pure chance. I was standing 3 feet to the left instead of 3 feet to the right. I was lucky, and they were not, and there is no justice in it. How do I come home carrying this? How do I sit at your table and talk about the weather when half my soul is buried in French and Belgian and German soil? No signature, no closing, just those questions hanging in the air. Sarah found the next letter, dated a week later. "Dear Mama, please forgive my last letter. I should not have written those things. I am fine. I am coming home soon. They say within the month. I cannot wait to see you, to sleep in my own bed, to sit on the porch. I have been thinking about what I will do when I get home. I think I would like simple work, honest work, maybe something where I can be outside, where I can walk and think. I've had enough of noise and chaos. I want quiet. I want peace. I want to be good, Mama. I want to be gentle. I want to be the kind of man who builds things instead of destroying them. I want to put as much good into the world as I can to balance out all the bad I have seen and done. Can a man change? Can I become someone different from the person this war has made me? I have to believe the answer is yes. I have to believe I can come home and be your son again." Your Bobby Sarah's vision blurred. Her father had come home broken, drowning in survivor's guilt, desperately trying to become someone good. And he'd succeeded. He'd spent 40 years walking mail routes, being kind to strangers, raising his daughter with patience and gentleness. He'd rebuilt himself from the ruins of war. He'd chosen peace, chosen kindness. It hadn't been his natural state. It had been a conscious decision, made every single day for 6 decades. Sarah stood, her legs stiff. She walked to the small window and looked out at the quiet street below. A few porch lights. A car passing. The ordinary, peaceful world her father had fought to preserve. She thought about another moment now, seeing it through this new lens. When she was 16, she'd gotten into a fight at school. She'd come home crying, furious, wanting revenge. Her father had sat her down at the kitchen table. "Sarah," he'd said, voice calm and measured, "I understand you're angry. Anger is natural, but acting on anger, that's a choice. And it's a choice that often makes things worse, not better." "But she," Sarah had started, "I know, she was wrong. But you being wrong back doesn't make her less wrong. It just makes 2 people wrong. You have a choice right now. You can escalate or you can break the cycle. I'm asking you to break the cycle." She'd been furious with him then. She'd thought he didn't understand, but he'd understood better than anyone. He'd spent years watching cycles of violence escalate. He'd seen where hatred leads. And he'd chosen every day to break those cycles in his own life. Sarah returned to the letters. She was nearing the end of the stack. One letter stopped her cold. Longer, more intimate, written in the middle of the night, by the look of the handwriting. "Dear Mama, it is 2 a.m. and I cannot sleep. Every time I close my eyes I see faces, sometimes my friends, sometimes Germans, boys I killed, boys who tried to kill me. Sometimes the prisoners from the camp, their eyes hollow and accusing, asking why I did not come sooner. The other fellows do not talk about this. We pretend we are fine. We joke. We make plans. We talk about girls and baseball and what kind of car we will buy. But Mama, I am not fine. I think we are all broken in ways that will never fully heal. And I do not know if the people back home will understand. How can they? They did not see what we saw. I am afraid to come home. I am afraid I will not fit anymore. I am afraid I will hurt the people I love with my silence, with my distance, with the parts of me that died over here. But I will come home anyway, and I will try. I will try so hard to be normal, to be the boy you remember, even if it is a performance. I will try, Mama. For you, I will try. Bobby Sarah's chest ached. Her father had been describing PTSD, except it didn't have that name in 1945. No diagnosis, no treatment, no understanding. Veterans were expected to come home and adjust. And if they couldn't, they suffered in silence. Her father had suffered in silence for 60 years. She thought about all the times he'd seemed distant. All the times he'd flinched at loud noises. Fireworks, car backfires, thunder. She'd thought he was just jumpy. Now she knew. He was back in Belgium, back in France, back in that frozen foxhole or that burning village. And he'd never told her. He'd carried it alone because he thought that was his job, to protect his family from his pain. Sarah found the last letter in the stack. August 1945, postmarked from New York. Dear Mama, I am in New York. I will be on a train to Georgia tomorrow. I will be home the day after that. I need to tell you something. I am not the same boy who left. I look the same mostly, but inside I am different. There is a hardness now, a vigilance, a part of me that never rests. Please be patient with me. Please do not ask too many questions. Please let me find my way back to myself slowly. And please, Mama, please do not tell anyone what I wrote in these letters. Keep them safe. Keep them private. Let the world think I was just a soldier who came home. Let them think I am fine. It is easier that way, for everyone. Your Bobby. So that was why the letters had been hidden. He'd asked his mother to keep them private, and she had. When she died, he'd taken them back, locked them away, kept his secrets safe. Until now. The last thing in the footlocker was a small envelope, separate from all the others, addressed to Sarah in her father's handwriting, recent handwriting, the shaky script of an old man. Her breath caught. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a key. My dear Sarah, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and you have found the footlocker. Part of me hoped you never would. Part of me hoped you would remember me only as the father you knew, quiet, simple, ordinary. But another part of me wants you to know the truth. Not because I want recognition, but because I want you to understand. I was not a hero, Sarah. I was just a young man who was terrified and did what he had to do. I was simply lucky enough to survive. I never spoke of the war because I did not want to burden you with my pain. I wanted you to grow up in peace and safety. I wanted to protect you from the darkness I carried, but silence has its own cost. By never speaking, I denied you the chance to know me fully. The key is to a safety deposit box at First Georgia Bank, Box 247. Inside, you will find my military records and letters from families of men I served with. Every day I spent with you was a gift. Every ordinary moment. Breakfast together, watching you do homework, walking you down the aisle, those were the moments that saved me. You were my peace, Sarah. You were my proof that the war was worth it. I loved being your father more than I loved anything else in this life. Thank you for giving me a reason to come home. Thank you for giving me a reason to stay. With all my love, Dad Sarah's sobs came then, deep and wrenching. She curled up on the dusty attic floor, clutching the letter to her chest, crying for the father she'd never truly known, crying for the boy who went to war, crying for the man who came home broken and spent a lifetime rebuilding himself in silence. Outside, the sun was beginning to rise. Sarah sat up slowly, wiping her face. She looked at the letters spread around her, the medals, the photographs, the uniform jacket. She picked up the citation again. The Silver Star. Her father had earned this by saving lives, and he'd never mentioned it. She thought about the safety deposit box, about what else might be hidden there. She needed to know more, not just what her father had done, but why he'd chosen to bury it all so deeply. The answers, Sarah was starting to realize, would be far more painful than she'd imagined. Chapter 3. The Truth Emerges. Sarah went to the bank 3 days later. Those 3 days had been strange, disorienting. She'd gone through the motions of regular life, answering emails, making dinner, talking with Mark, but her mind was elsewhere. Somewhere in Belgium in 1944. Somewhere in a frozen foxhole with a boy named Bobby who would become her father. Mark had noticed. 20 years of marriage made it impossible to hide much. "You've been different since you went to your dad's house," he'd said gently one evening. "Do you want to talk about it?" "I found letters," she'd said finally. "From the war. He was different than I thought. He did things I didn't know about. He was a hero, an actual hero, and he never told me. Why do you think that was? I don't know yet, but I'm going to find out." Now she stood in First Georgia Bank, the small key clutched in her hand. The same bank her father had used for decades. "I need to access a safety deposit box," Sarah said. "Box 247. It belonged to my father. He passed away recently." Documentation, proof of death, proof of relationship. Finally, the bank manager, Mr. Chen, who'd known her father, led her to the vault. "Your father was a good man," Mr. Chen said, "always polite. He came in once a month like clockwork, just to check on the box. Never took anything out, just checked to make sure it was secure. Once a month for how many years?" Her father had been visiting these memories regularly, alone, carrying the weight in private. The vault was cool and quiet. 2 keys turned, and the long metal box slid out, heavier than expected. "Take your time," Mr. Chen said, gesturing to a private room. Sarah carried the box to the small, windowless room and stared at it before opening it. Inside were manila folders neatly labeled in her father's handwriting, military records, unit rosters, after-action reports, commendations. And beneath those, bundles of letters, not from her father but to him. She opened the first folder. Official military record, Robert Harold Mitchell. Born February 14, 1923. Enlisted October 1942, age 19. 82nd Airborne Division, 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment, Company E. Deployed to England, February 1943. Sicily invasion, July 1943. Wounded, minor shrapnel, returned to duty. Normandy, June 6, 1944. Market Garden, September 1944. Battle of the Bulge, December 1944. Promoted to Corporal, January 1945. Bronze Star for Valor, July 1943. Purple Heart, July 1943. Silver Star for Valor, December 1944. 2 medals for Valor, and he'd displayed none of them. The Bronze Star citation was for actions in Sicily. Her father had pulled 2 wounded men to safety under heavy machine gun fire. Sarah set aside the military records and picked up the next folder. Unit Roster, Company E, 505th PIR. A typed list of names. Next to each, a notation. KIA, killed in action. WIA, wounded in action. MIA, missing in action. Mitchell, Robert H., CPL, survived. Of the 187 men who'd deployed to England in 1943, only 61 were marked survived. 2/3 casualties. Sarah's hand shook as she scanned the list. Kowalski, James T., KIA, 6th of June, 1944. Henderson, Thomas R., KIA, 15th July, 1944. Russo, Daniel, WIA, 7th June, 1944. RTD, KIA, 19th of December, 1944. The men from her father's letters. Most were dead. No wonder he'd carried such guilt. How does a man live with being one of the lucky ones? The next folder contained after-action reports. At approximately 0300 hours, enemy forces numbering approximately 40-50 launched an assault on our position. Corporal Mitchell, taking command after Sergeant Williams, was KIA, organized defensive positions. The report of the action that earned him the Silver Star. His squad, 12 men, had been cut off during the German counteroffensive in the Ardennes. They'd been holding a crossroads needed for evacuation of wounded. The Germans attacked repeatedly over 4 hours. Her father's sergeant killed in the first assault. Radio destroyed. They were alone, outnumbered 4-1, running low on ammunition. Corporal Mitchell had organized a fighting withdrawal, keeping the Germans at bay while moving wounded men back toward friendly lines. He'd personally carried 3 wounded men, one at a time, under fire. He'd sent the rest of his squad ahead while he stayed behind with the machine gun until his ammunition was exhausted. He'd made it back with a bullet hole through his jacket and frostbite on both feet. Every man in his squad survived. The recommending officer wrote, "Corporal Mitchell's actions were above and beyond the call of duty. His courage, leadership, and selfless devotion to his men prevented certain casualties. He is recommended for the highest recognition." The highest recognition, Medal of Honor. But he'd received the Silver Star instead. Sarah wondered why. Maybe her father had declined the higher honor, not wanting attention. That seemed like something he would do. Sarah picked up the bundles of letters. These were different from the attic letters. These were letters sent to her father after the war, from families of men he'd served with. She opened the first, carefully. November 1945, from Pennsylvania. Dear Mr. Mitchell, I hope this letter finds you well. My name is Helen Kowalski. I'm the mother of James Kowalski, who served with you in the 82nd Airborne. In July 1944, I received a letter from you telling me about my Jimmy's death at Normandy. That letter was the greatest comfort I have ever known. The telegram was so cold, so official. It told me my son was dead, but nothing about how he died or whether he suffered. Your letter told me that Jimmy was brave, that he died quickly, that you were with him, that his last words were about me. You told me he had been laughing just hours before. You told me he was loved by his unit. Mr. Mitchell, I have read your letter every day since I received it. Knowing that my Jimmy did not die alone, that someone cared enough to hold him and remember him and write to his mother, that has made the unbearable slightly more bearable. I do not know how to thank you. You were in the middle of a war, but you took the time to write to a grieving mother. That is something I will treasure until I join him. With deepest gratitude, Helen Kowalski. Sarah's eyes burned. She picked up another letter, then another. Mothers, fathers, wives, sisters, all thanking her father for letters he'd sent about their loved ones who had died. He'd written to all of them. Every family of every man who died in his squad, his platoon, his company. Dozens of letters written in field hospitals and foxholes, telling families about how their sons and husbands had died. Telling them they'd been brave, that they hadn't suffered, that they'd been loved. It must have taken weeks of his life, and he'd never mentioned it. One letter was from a widow, October 1945. Dear Corporal Mitchell, my name is Margaret Rousseau. My husband Danny served with you. He spoke of you in his letters as the best man in the outfit. Danny was wounded at Normandy but recovered and returned. He was so proud. He wrote in November 1944 that he would be home by Christmas. We were going to start a family. He died on December 19, 1944. Your letter reached me in January. You told me Danny died protecting his friends, that he saved another man's life, that his last words were my name. I do not know if that is true. I suspect you may have told me what I needed to hear, but I am grateful anyway. Danny's mother told me you were the one who held the position while others evacuated. That you came back for him, carried him even though he was already gone, because you promised you would never leave anyone behind. I want you to know that I do not blame you. Danny loved his friends. He loved you. And I think he would be glad you survived. Please live a long and happy life. Please have children and grandchildren. Please make Danny's sacrifice mean something by living fully, by choosing joy. That is what he would want. With love and gratitude, Margaret Rousseau Sarah couldn't see anymore. Tears streamed down her face, dropping onto the old paper. Danny Rousseau, the boy from Brooklyn, who died on December 19th, 1944, the same day her father earned the Silver Star. The same action. Her father had watched his friend die doing it, and Margaret Rousseau had told him to live, to be happy, to make the sacrifice mean something. Had he? Sarah thought about his quiet life, his simple routines. Had that been happiness, or just survival? She thought about the cardinal in the garden, the way her father had watched it with such intensity, as if trying to absorb every molecule of beauty. Maybe that had been his way of keeping the promise. Notice every beautiful thing, live fully in the small moments. There was one more folder at the bottom, thicker than the others, the label, The Truth. Inside were photographs she hadn't seen, candid shots, her father with his squad, arms around each other, grinning, a group around a fire, playing cards, Danny Russo making a face, Tom Henderson reading a letter, Jimmy Kowalski toasting the camera, young men, boys really, none older than 23. Beneath the photographs was a handwritten document. Many pages, her father's handwriting from the 1950s, the title, What I Cannot Forget. I'm writing this in 1955, 10 years after the war ended. My doctor suggested that putting memories on paper might help with the nightmares. I'm also writing because I do not want these stories to die with me. If something happens before my daughter is old enough to understand, I want someone to know what happened. I want someone to know who these men were. What followed was a detailed account of her father's war. Not the censored letters home, but the truth, the fear, the chaos, the friendships formed under fire, the horrors. He wrote about D-Day, about jumping into darkness over Normandy, about landing in a tree while tracer fire lit up the night, about finding Jimmy Kowalski at dawn, sitting against a hedgerow with his chest torn open, already dead. I held him for a long time. Eventually, Lieutenant Shaw ordered me to move out. I left Jimmy there. I did not have time to bury him. I wrote to his mother a month later and told her he died quickly, that he did not suffer. This was a lie. I do not know how quickly he died, but his mother needed to believe her son's death had meaning and dignity, so I gave her that. He wrote about the grinding advance through France, friends lost one by one, Tom Henderson, who'd survived 3 months only to step on a mine. That is how war is. Not glorious, not dramatic, just random and stupid and wasteful. Tom died because he needed to relieve himself and chose the wrong spot. There is no meaning in that, just waste. He wrote about Market Garden, about Danny Russo getting shot through the shoulder and refusing evacuation. Danny was the heart of our squad. He could make anyone laugh, even when we were wet and cold and scared. When he came back from the hospital after Normandy, we threw him a party. We sat in a barn and ate and drank and laughed, and for one night we forgot about the war. I think that night might have been the happiest moment of my life. Finally, December 19th, 1944. We had been ordered to hold a crossroads. Intelligence said the Germans were retreating. Intelligence was wrong. Sergeant Williams was killed in the first minute. I took command. I did not want to, but there was no one else. We held them off for 2 attacks, but we were running low on ammunition. 3 men wounded, radio destroyed. We were alone. I made the decision to withdraw. I sent the men back with the wounded. I stayed with the machine gun. Danny stayed with me. I ordered him to go. He refused. "You're not dying alone out here," he said. "Shut up and keep shooting." We held them for another hour. I carried the wounded back, one at a time. Danny kept the machine gun going. When I came back for the 3rd man, Danny said, "That's all of them, let's get out of here." We were almost clear when Danny saw movement. He shouted a warning. German soldier, 20 yards away, raising his rifle. Danny shoved me, hard. The bullet that would have killed me hit Danny instead. He fell on top of me. I could feel his blood, hot against my face. The bullet had hit him high in the chest, lung shot, maybe heart. "Mags," he whispered, his wife's name. "Tell Mags." He died before he could finish. I carried him anyway. I do not know why. He was already dead. We were still under fire, but I had promised we would never leave anyone behind. I made it back. I gave Danny to Graves' registration. I was told I would receive a medal. I did not want a medal. I wanted Danny back. I wanted to be the one who died so he could go home to Margaret. But I could not do any of that. So I accepted the medal. And I wrote to Margaret. And I lied and told her Danny had not suffered, that his last words were her name. All of this is true, except the part about him not suffering. He suffered. He was conscious for nearly 30 seconds. I saw the fear in his eyes, but Margaret did not need to know that. Danny Russo saved my life. The life I'm living now, my wife, my daughter, every breath I take, it all belongs to him. I'm living on borrowed time. I'm living a life that should have been his, so I try to live well. I try to be kind. I try to notice the beautiful things. Not because I am naturally good, but because I owe Danny that much. I owe all of them. If I can be a good man, if I can live a good life, then maybe their deaths meant something. Maybe my survival was a responsibility, a debt I can never fully repay but must try to honor every single day. The document ended there. Sarah sat surrounded by her father's history and finally understood. He hadn't been silent because he was cold or distant. He'd been silent because the truth was too heavy to share, because he loved his family enough to carry the darkness alone. Every gentle moment had been an act of will. Every patient word had been a victory over trauma. Every ordinary day had been him keeping a promise, to live well, to be good, to make their sacrifice mean something. Her father had been a hero every single day, choosing peace over trauma, choosing kindness over bitterness. And Sarah had never known, had never understood, had never asked the right questions. She gathered the documents, placed them back in the box. But she kept one photograph, her father with his squad, all of them young and alive and grinning. These men had given her father the life he'd lived. And her father had given her the life she was living. She was connected to them now. Their sacrifice had echoed forward through time and created her. She owed them what her father had owed them, to live well, to be kind, to make it mean something. But first, she needed to know more. She needed to find the people who remembered, the families, the survivors, because the truth, painful as it was, deserved to be known. These men deserved to be remembered not just as names, but as the living, breathing, laughing, loving people they had been. Sarah left the bank with the photograph and a list of names. She had work to do. The first person Sarah called was James Kowalski, Jr. She'd found his number in the safety deposit box, the same man who'd written to her father 8 years ago. Sarah sat in her car outside the bank for 20 minutes before she found the courage to dial. The phone rang 4 times. She was about to hang up when a man's voice answered. "Hello? Mr. Kowalski? James Kowalski, Jr.? Yes, this is Jim. Who's calling?" Sarah took a breath. "My name is Sarah Mitchell. I'm Robert Mitchell's daughter." There was a long pause. "Bob Mitchell, from the 82nd. "Yes." Another pause. When Jim spoke again, his voice was thick. "How is he? I wrote to him years ago, but never heard back." Sarah's throat tightened. "He passed away 3 weeks ago. I'm so sorry." "Oh." The word came out like air leaving a balloon. "I'm very sorry for your loss. Your father was a remarkable man. I'm learning that. I found his letters from the war. And I found your letter to him. About your father. About Jimmy." "My dad," Jim said softly. "I never knew him. He died at Normandy 3 months before I was born. Everything I know comes from my mother's stories and that one letter from your father. Do you still have it, the letter my father wrote?" "I do. My mother left it to me. I keep it framed on my desk. Would you like to hear it?" "Please." Papers rustled. Then Jim began to read, his voice catching. "Dear Mrs. Kowalski, I am writing about your husband, James. Jimmy, as we knew him. I served with him in Company E, 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment. He was my friend. Jimmy died bravely on June 6, 1944, during the invasion of Normandy. His death was quick. He did not suffer. I was with him at the end. Before we jumped, Jimmy showed me a photograph of you. He talked about you constantly, your kindness, your laugh. He said when the war was over, he'd take you dancing every Saturday for the rest of your lives. He said he was going to be the best father in the world. In his last moments, he spoke your name. He wanted you to know he loved you, that he was thinking of you, that he was sorry he wouldn't be coming home. Mrs. Kowalski, I know no words can ease your pain. But I want you to know, your husband was one of the finest men I ever knew. He was brave and kind and funny. He was loved by every man in our unit. I am so very sorry. If there is anything I can do for you or your child, please write. Your family will always be in my prayers. With deepest sympathy, Private Robert Mitchell. Jim stopped reading. Sarah could hear him breathing, composing himself. Your father wrote that from France in July 1944, Jim said. 1 month after my dad died, in the middle of a war. He took the time to write that letter to a woman he'd never met. Did your mother ever meet him? No, she wanted to, but never had the means to travel to Georgia. But she told me once that your father's letter saved her life. After my dad died, she didn't want to go on. She was 22, pregnant, alone, but that letter reminded her that my father had loved her, that their love had meant something. It gave her a reason to keep living. Sarah wiped her eyes. My father never told me he did that. That sounds like him. The men of that generation didn't talk about those things. They carried it quietly. Why? Sarah asked. Why did they stay silent? Jim was quiet for a moment. I teach history at Penn State. I've spent my life studying World War II, and I think they stayed silent because the truth was too terrible to share, because they didn't want to burden the people they loved, and because they didn't think anyone who wasn't there could possibly understand. Sarah thought about the letters, the drafted paragraphs crossed out. Maybe silence is better than truth. My father wrote that he couldn't find words, she said. There probably weren't any, Jim agreed. How do you describe watching your friends die? How do you explain survivor's guilt? How do you come home and talk about the weather when part of you is still on a beach in France? So they just didn't talk. They got jobs, raised families, mowed lawns, tried to be normal. And inside, they carried the war every single day for the rest of their lives. Sarah thought about her father flinching at loud noises, staring into space, the nightmares he'd mentioned but never discussed. Did your mother talk about the cost of loving someone carrying that trauma? She said it was like living with a ghost, Jim said softly. Not my father's ghost. She'd made peace with his death. But the ghost of who men like your father had been before the war. She said you could see it in their eyes sometimes. A distance, a sadness that never went away. She said the war had taken something they could never get back, and the people who loved them learned to love them anyway, with the pieces that remained. Sarah closed her eyes. That was it exactly, the distance in her father's eyes. The part of him always somewhere else. After she hung up, Sarah sat in her car and cried, quiet tears of understanding. Her father hadn't been emotionally distant. He'd been protecting her, loving her the only way he knew how, by keeping the horror at bay, by building a world of safety around her. She called Mark. I need to tell you something. At home, she showed him everything. The letters, the medals, the photographs, the document titled What I Cannot Forget. Mark read in silence, his expression growing more somber. When he finished, he looked up with tears in his eyes. We had Sunday dinners for 20 years, and I didn't know him at all. Neither did I, Sarah said. That was the point. He didn't want us to know. But why? Because he loved us. Silence was his way of protecting us from what he'd seen and done. Mark shook his head slowly. The strength that took, every day for 60 years, to wake up with those memories and choose to be gentle anyway, choose to be patient, choose to be present even when part of him was still in Belgium. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She got up and began writing down all the small moments she'd misunderstood. A catalogue of her father's love, expressed in ways she'd been too blind to see. The way he'd always made her breakfast before school, real breakfast. Eggs, bacon, orange juice. He'd wake at 5:30, though his route didn't start until 8. She'd thought he was just an early riser. Now she understood. He was making sure his daughter never went hungry because he'd seen what weaponized hunger looked like. The way he'd taught her to drive, so patient, never raising his voice. She'd thought he was calm by nature. Now she understood. He'd learned patience in war, learned that anger and panic got people killed, learned that steadiness was sometimes the only thing that kept you alive. The way he'd insisted on finishing everything on her plate. She'd thought he was being strict. Now she understood. He was teaching her gratitude, to waste nothing, to honor those who had less. The way he'd volunteered at the VA hospital every Saturday for 30 years. She'd thought it was civic duty. Now she understood. He was staying connected to men who understood, who'd seen what he'd seen, with whom he didn't have to pretend. The way he'd cried at her wedding. She'd thought they were tears of joy. Now she understood. He was thinking of Danny Russo, who never got to walk his children down the aisle. He was thinking of all the men who didn't get daughters or weddings or ordinary beautiful days. And he was grateful beyond words. Everything she'd thought was simple had been complex. Everything she thought was easy had been hard-won. Her father's gentleness hadn't been natural. It had been a daily choice, made in defiance of trauma and memory. The next day, Sarah tracked down Margaret Russo's daughter, Elena Russo Davis, in New Jersey. "My mother never remarried," Elena told her. "She said she'd had her great love. She dated in the 50s and 60s, but always came back to my father, to the memory of him." Did she talk about him? Constantly. She kept his photograph on her bedside table, wore his dog tags until she died, and she told us about your father. She did. She said your father was the reason she knew my dad's death meant something, that he hadn't died alone or forgotten. She said your father's letter kept her from giving up, and she told us how your father carried our dad's body through the snow, how he kept his promise to never leave anyone behind. Sarah's voice caught. "My father never talked about any of this." "I know. My mother tried to find him once, in the 60s. She found his address and drove to Georgia. But when she got to his house, she couldn't knock." "Why not?" "She watched him through the window. He was in his backyard with a little girl. You, probably. You were maybe 5 or 6. He was teaching you to plant tomatoes. And she said he looked at peace, happy, like he'd built a good life. She didn't want to disrupt that, didn't want to bring the war back. So she got in her car and drove home." Sarah closed her eyes, seeing the memory differently. She remembered that day, her father's hands dirt-stained and patient, showing her how to dig the hole, how to water gently. "I'm planting memories, sweetheart," he'd said. "When you eat these tomatoes, you'll remember this day. You'll remember us working together. That's what gardening is. Planting memories for your future self." She'd been 5. She hadn't understood. Now she did. He'd been choosing joy, choosing to create beauty, choosing to plant things that would grow rather than dwell on things that had died. "Your father kept his promise to my dad," Elena said. "He lived, he had a family, he found happiness. That's what my mother wanted to see. And she said it was enough." One afternoon, Sarah visited the Valdosta VA hospital where her father had volunteered. An elderly man named Frank Morrison, who'd served in Korea, remembered him well. "Bob Mitchell was the quietest man I ever met," Frank said. "They sat in the hospital garden under an oak tree, but when you needed someone to listen, he was there. He didn't judge, didn't try to fix things, just listened." "Did he ever talk about his own experiences?" Frank shook his head. "Not in words, but you could tell. Those of us who'd been there, we recognized each other. The way we carried ourselves, the way we reacted to sounds, the way we understood things without saying them." "What things?" Frank looked at her, eyes kind but sad. "The weight, honey. We all carried weight. Some talked about it, some drank to forget it, some couldn't function, and some, like your father, just carried it quietly and tried to help others carry theirs." "Was he happy?" Frank considered carefully. I think he was at peace. That's different from happy, but maybe better. He'd made peace with what happened. He'd forgiven himself for surviving. He'd found purpose in service and joy in simple things. He'd built a life worth living. Not everybody who came home managed that. Your father did. That's no small thing. Sarah thought about the cardinal, the tomato plants, the crossword puzzles, the quiet rituals. Not happiness, maybe, but peace, purpose, a life deliberately constructed from ruins. He talked about you sometimes, Frank said. His daughter. He was so proud. Said you were his proof that the world could still be good, that there was still innocence worth protecting. I think you were his anchor, the reason he kept going. Sarah's vision blurred. I wish I'd known. I wish I'd understood. He didn't want you to understand, Frank said gently. That was the whole point. He wanted you to grow up where you didn't have to carry what he carried, where you could be innocent and safe and happy. That was his gift, not his stories, but his silence. Not his trauma, but his protection from it. Sarah sat in the garden long after Frank left. She thought about gifts and sacrifices and the different ways people show love. Her father had given her everything. Not wealth or stories passed down through generations, but safety, peace, a childhood unmarred by the darkness he carried, a life built on the foundation of his silence. And now, finally, she understood why he'd never spoken, why he'd hidden the medals and letters and truth. Because love isn't always about sharing everything. Sometimes love is about carrying the darkness alone so others can walk in the light. Sometimes the greatest gift is silence. Her father had been a hero twice, once in Belgium when he'd saved lives under fire, and once every day after when he'd chosen to carry the weight alone, to be gentle despite having seen violence, to build rather than break. And Sarah had been the beneficiary of both kinds of heroism without ever knowing it. Until now. She pulled out her phone and looked at the photograph. Her father and his squad, young and alive and grinning, Jimmy, Danny, Tom, all the boys who'd given their lives. Her father had spent 60 years honoring their sacrifice by living well, by being good, by making their deaths mean something through the quality of his life. Now it was Sarah's turn to honor them, to honor him, to make sure these stories weren't lost. But she needed to find the right way. A way to honor the silence while breaking it, to respect his choice to carry the darkness alone, while also sharing the light of who he'd been. The answer would require one more step, one more piece of the puzzle that would make everything clear. Sarah stood at the entrance of the Valdosta Military Museum, clutching a cardboard box that held her father's entire war. It had taken her 3 months to get here. 3 months of phone calls and careful planning. 3 months of wrestling with a question that kept her awake. Did she have the right to share what her father had chosen to keep private? The museum director, a retired Marine colonel named Patricia Henderson, met her at the door. "Miss Mitchell, I'm so glad you could make it." They walked through quiet halls lined with photographs and artifacts. The smell reminded her of her father's attic, old fabric, metal, preserved history. In a small office, Colonel Henderson gestured to a chair. "I've been thinking about your father's collection since you first contacted me. It's extraordinary. Not just the military records, but the personal correspondence. That document he wrote in 1955. That alone is a historical treasure." Sarah set the box on the desk. "I need to know I'm doing the right thing. My father kept this hidden for 60 years. He didn't want people to know." "Why do you think that was?" "Because he was protecting us. He didn't want to be seen as a hero. He just wanted to live quietly and be a good man." Colonel Henderson nodded. "The ones who talk the most usually saw the least. The ones who saw the worst usually say nothing. Your father sounds like the latter." "He was." Sarah touched the box. "So why am I here? Why am I breaking his silence?" "Are you breaking it? Or honoring it differently? Your father chose silence to protect his family, but you're not breaking that silence for yourself. You're breaking it for the men who died, for Jimmy Kowalski and Danny Russo. Your father honored them through how he lived. You're honoring them by making sure they're remembered. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. I want to do this right. I don't want to sensationalize his trauma. Then we won't. We'll create an exhibit, but thoughtfully. We'll let your father's own words tell the story. We'll center it on the human cost, on the men who died and the man who survived them. A memorial, not a glorification. Sarah thought about the photograph. 10 young men, most dead before their 23rd birthdays. They deserve to be remembered as people, she said, not just names on a casualty list. Jimmy wanted to take his wife dancing. Danny made everyone laugh. Tom loved westerns. They were real. Then that's what we'll show. Over 2 months, Sarah worked with the museum staff to design the exhibit. They created a timeline of Company E's service. They displayed her father's uniform and medals. They printed excerpts from letters on the walls, his words from 1944 speaking across 80 years. But the heart of the exhibit was a room Sarah called the Squad. 10 panels, one for each man in the photograph. Each showed a photo of the soldier in civilian clothes, before the war, when they were just young men with futures. Beneath each, a brief biography, where they were from, what they'd dreamed of, who they'd left behind. For the 6 who died, the final information, where and when they'd fallen, and words from letters her father had written to their families. Jimmy Kowalski's panel showed him at his wedding, impossibly young and happy. James Theodore Kowalski, born 1922, Erie, Pennsylvania. Farm boy who loved music, died June 6, 1944, Normandy, age 22. Left behind wife Helen and unborn son James Jr. From Corporal Robert Mitchell to Mrs. Helen Kowalski, Jimmy was one of the finest men I ever knew. In his last moments he spoke your name. Danny Russo's panel showed him in a Brooklyn Dodgers cap, making a goofy face. Daniel Vincent Russo, born 1921, Brooklyn, could make anyone laugh. Wounded at Normandy, returned to duty. Died December 19, 1944, Battle of the Bulge, age 23. Left behind wife Margaret, from Corporal Mitchell to Mrs. Margaret Russo. Danny died protecting his friends. He saved another man's life moments before he died. His last words were your name. For the survivors, including her father, panels showed their post-war lives. Her father's showed 2 photos, the young paratrooper in 1944 and him in his mail carrier uniform in the 1980s, smiling gently. Robert Harold Mitchell, born 1923, Valdosta, Georgia, served in Sicily, Normandy, Holland, Belgium. Awarded Bronze Star, Purple Heart, Silver Star. Survived. Mail carrier, 1946-1986. Volunteered at VA hospital for 30 years. Died March 2024, age 101. Never spoke publicly about his service. Beneath that, a quote from his 1955 document, I am living a life that should have been Danny's or Jimmy's. So I try to live well. I try to be kind. If I can be a good man, then maybe their deaths meant something. The exhibit opened on Veterans Day. Jim Kowalski Jr. flew in from Pennsylvania. Elena Russo Davis came from New Jersey. The museum was packed with veterans, active military, families, teachers with students. Sarah watched people move slowly from panel to panel, reading, studying photographs. Many were crying. Others stood in silence, hands over hearts. Jim Kowalski stood before his father's panel for a long time. When he turned to Sarah, his eyes were wet. I've never seen him like this, as a person, as a man with friends and dreams. Thank you for making him real. Elena Russo hugged Sarah tightly. My mother would have loved this. She would have been so proud. One elderly man stood before her father's panel for nearly 30 minutes. Finally, he approached Sarah. I served in Vietnam, he said, voice rough. I never talked about it either. Got a job, raised my family, never said a word. My kids don't understand. Sarah took his hand. Would you like to tell me about it? The man's eyes filled. I don't know if I can. That's okay. You don't have to. But if you ever want to, I'm here to listen. The man nodded and walked away. But 20 minutes later, Sarah saw him talking to a volunteer, gesturing, his face animated, telling his story, maybe for the first time in 50 years. That night, alone in the squad room, Sarah looked at each panel, each face, each story. These men had been dead 80 years, but today they'd been alive again. People had spoken their names, learned their stories, honored their sacrifice. She stood before her father's panel. "I hope I did right by you, Dad. I know you wanted silence. But these men deserved to be remembered. And you deserve to be understood, not as a hero on a pedestal, but as a human being who saw terrible things and chose to be kind anyway." She touched the photograph. "I understand now why you never talked. It wasn't weakness or distance. It was love. It was you standing between us and the darkness so we could live in the light." Sarah thought about the cardinal. The tomato plants, the patient driving lessons, all the small moments that had been extraordinary acts of will. "I'm going to try to do what you did. Live well. Be kind. Notice beautiful things. Put good into the world. Because that's what you taught me." She pulled out her phone and looked at a photo from that morning, her daughter Emma, age 7, looking up at her grandfather's panel with wide, curious eyes. "Mommy, was Grandpa really a hero?" "Yes," Sarah had answered, "but not the way you think. He was a hero because he was kind, because he was patient, because he chose to be gentle even when the world had been cruel. That's harder than being brave in battle. Can I be a hero like that?" "Yes, sweetheart, that's exactly the kind of hero you can be." Over the following weeks, the exhibit became one of the museum's most visited. Schools brought students, veterans groups organized tours. Local media covered it, treating it with respect and dignity. After one talk, a young soldier in army fatigues approached her. He looked troubled. "Ma'am, I just got back from Afghanistan 6 months ago. I'm having a hard time adjusting. I don't sleep well. Loud noises bother me. But I don't want to talk about it because I don't want people to think I'm weak." Sarah looked at this young man, seeing her father at 22. "You're not weak. You're human. And you're carrying something heavy. My father carried it for 60 years, and it cost him. Please don't do what he did. Please talk to someone. Get help. There's no shame in admitting that war changes you." The soldier's eyes were wet. "Did your father ever get help?" "No, there wasn't much available, but that doesn't mean it was the right choice. You have more resources. Use them, please." The young man nodded. "I have an appointment at the VA next week. I've been thinking about cancelling, but I won't. I'll go for your dad." 6 months later, Sarah received a letter from the 82nd Airborne Division Association. They wanted to honor her father posthumously at their annual reunion. Sarah attended with Mark and Emma. Hundreds of paratroopers filled a ballroom at Fort Bragg. When they called her father's name, Sarah walked to the stage with Emma's hand in hers. A general presented the medals and spoke about Corporal Mitchell's service. This soldier exemplified the finest traditions of the 82nd Airborne. He was brave in combat and humble in peace. He saved lives under fire and honored his fallen comrades by living well. Sarah accepted the medals. When she spoke, her voice was clear. "My father never wanted this attention, but I think he would be proud that we're remembering not just him, but all the men who served with him." She held up the photograph of the squad. "These are the real heroes. Young men who answered their country's call, who left behind families and dreams. My father spent 60 years trying to make their sacrifice mean something, and he did that by being a good man, by being kind and patient and gentle." Sarah looked at the audience, young faces and old. "If you want to honor my father, here's how. Live well. Be kind. Notice beautiful things. Love your families. Choose peace whenever you can. That's what my father did. That's the legacy he left me. And that's the legacy I hope to leave my daughter." Emma squeezed her hand. Sarah squeezed back. On the 3rd anniversary of her father's death, Sarah took Emma to visit his grave. They brought sunflowers, bright and cheerful, the kind that turned toward the light. Emma placed the flowers at the headstone. Sarah had chosen the inscription carefully. Robert Harold Mitchell, 1923 to 2024. Beloved father and grandfather, U.S. Army, 82nd Airborne Division. He carried the darkness so others could walk in the light. Emma traced the letters. Tell me about Grandpa again, Mummy. Sarah sat on the grass, Emma beside her. Your grandfather was one of the bravest men I've ever known. Not because he wasn't afraid, but because he was afraid and did what needed to be done anyway. He jumped out of airplanes. He fought in terrible battles. He watched his friends die. But he didn't break. Oh, he broke, sweetheart. But he put himself back together piece by piece, day by day, and he did that by choosing to be kind, to be gentle, to be patient, to live well. Emma was quiet, thinking. When I grow up, I want to be like Grandpa. What part of him? The part that was kind even when things were hard, the part that noticed beautiful things, the part that kept promises. Sarah pulled her daughter close, tears streaming. That's exactly right, baby. That's exactly who he was. They sat together for a long time, grandmother's legacy flowing to granddaughter like a river of light. Around them, hundreds of graves marked other veterans, other stories mostly untold. But Robert Mitchell's story had been told, his silence honored and understood, his sacrifice, both in Belgium and daily afterward, recognized, and his legacy would continue. Through Sarah, through Emma, through everyone who'd learned that heroism isn't just courage in battle, but the choice to be gentle in a violent world. Sarah stood, brushing grass from her jeans. She looked at her father's grave, at the sunflowers bright against grey stone. Thank you, Dad, she whispered. Thank you for everything you gave me, especially the things you never told me about. Thank you for the silence that protected me and the love that shaped me. Emma took her hand. Ready to go, Mummy? Yes, sweetheart. Let's go home. They walked through the cemetery as the sun set, painting the sky gold and pink. Beautiful, Sarah thought. Her father would have stopped to notice this. So Sarah stopped. She and Emma stood together, watching the sunset, noticing the beautiful thing, living in the moment, being present, being grateful, being the people Robert Mitchell had made possible by surviving, by living well, by choosing every day to be good. That was his real legacy, not the medals or citations, but the life he'd built. The daughter he'd raised, the granddaughter who would carry his values forward. The sun sank lower, and Sarah and Emma walked on, hand in hand, carrying the light forward into the gathering dark. If this story moved you, think about the untold stories in your own family. How many of our parents and grandparents carried burdens we never understood? How many chose silence out of love? Leave a comment sharing what you wish you'd asked your parents or grandparents about their past. What stories were left untold? What do you wish you'd understood while you still had the chance? And subscribe for more stories that honor the silent heroes whose sacrifices we must never forget. Stories of ordinary people who did extraordinary things. Stories reminding us that heroism isn't always loud. Sometimes it's as quiet as a father tending his garden, as simple as choosing every day to be gentle despite having seen the worst. These stories matter, these people matter, and as long as we remember them, they live on. Thank you for watching. Thank you for remembering. Thank you for honoring the silent heroes among us.